Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and author of the newly released book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. Visit ignitingnation.com and scroll to the bottom of the page, type in your email address, and get that first chapter for free, and then order the book for yourself. This morning we're visiting with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, author of the newly released book, The Deeper State, Inside the War on Trump by Corrupt Elites, Secret Societies, and the Builders of an Imminent Final Empire. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, U.S. Army retired, is a regular, experienced, and internationally known expert on national and foreign affairs. He currently serves as the National Security and Foreign Affairs Analyst for Salem Radio. He's a regular guest on several other radio programs and a Fox News military analyst. He's the Vice President of MESMO and on assignment at the Pentagon. So fortunately today we get him on Martin Luther King Day when he has a day off. Colonel Maginnis received his Bachelor's of Science from the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York in 1973, a Master's from the Naval Postgraduate School, California in 1983. He's a graduate of many military schools, including the Command and General Staff College and the U.S. Army's War College Strategy course. Born on October 3, 1950 in Orlando, Florida, raised in Alabama, California, and Tennessee. He and his wife Jan have 2 children. They've made their home in Woodridge, Virginia since 1990 and are active members at Calvary Baptist Church in Woodridge, Virginia. Colonel Maginnis, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Well, thanks for having me, Rabbi. It's my privilege.
It's good, just very, very good to see you again. Nice to see old friends and watch the contemporization. You have many books that you've written, and every one of those books has brought us insight into the current state of affairs. What I've seen in the last 2 books that we've talked about, the prior book and then The Deeper State, is that you're actually describing the current conditions in Washington, this deeper state that the media has referred to, and we're going to get into a deeper explanation of that. But also there is I want to say there's a new prophetic point of view which is permeating a lot of your work, that's saying that we are in those times which God has been talking about in His Word, where He's setting things in motion. He's setting the stage for these events. So rather than the natural person being worried, upset, concerned, and fearful, you continue to bring a message of God is sovereign and everything is as it should be, but we need to understand the players and who they are.
Clearly, Rabbi, I've been here in Washington in and out for 50 years. I'm currently, as you indicated, at the Pentagon. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked with most of the federal agencies, with the White House. I've worked with politicians. I've worked as a non-government organization, the Family Research Council in Washington. And then, of course, in the private sector. And my friends are embedded deep throughout this federal government. So I've seen a lot. Plus, I've been in the media, very much so, national media, international media. So this has given me a conviction to write about things that I'm seeing, experiencing firsthand. Most people don't experience this, and so I felt it was incumbent upon me to at least give a perspective as to what's going on today. And that led to the writing of The Deeper State, because of clearly what I saw happening last year and the year before. We found that it seemed as if everything had gone haywire. But in fact, I think, as you point out, that we're just getting closer to the end times, and that God is aligning things in a way that perhaps none of us anticipated in the outset. But clearly, His revelation is beginning to point fingers at a lot of the players that I think that I at least address either indirectly or directly, certainly in The Deeper State.
we have heard about the Illuminati, the Masonic order that has been around since rumored to be the days of King Solomon, carrying secrets. We look at the Masonic symbols, we look at the dollar bill, we look at the pyramid, the eye. There's so many things that are linked back. Even Taco Bell today is using that very scary tactic as a way to promote their product, which is really quite interesting that it would have that massive appeal, that people would be that aware of it. You've experienced firsthand, and you describe in the book firsthand, that there are the power brokers. There are the elite behind the scenes, puppeteers, and those that are pulling the string. And during the 8 years of the Obama administration, we suspected that there were other factors, other players, other influencers. We named some of them just because of his known past, but yet with the Clinton campaign, with the investigation and the exposure or exposés of the Clinton Foundation, the pay-to-play, and all of these players that seem to be still embedded into Washington, that there is this underpinning of something other than the constitutional agenda of the United States government.
Well, there's no doubt that, when you watch the nightly news, when you are about the business of just living day to day, raising your children, doing your job, that you like to think that the political authorities that you sent to Washington, that you elected, are going to get the business of the people done. Clearly, we have a federal government that is supposed to be serving the interests of the American people, and of course, answering to the president, who we duly elect. But behind the scenes is a different story. And in fact, the people that we duly elect often fall prey to those that have deep pockets, that have other agendas than what is, I would argue, in the best interest of the American people. And that's what I call the political influencers, the lobbyists, of which there are thousands, and I've known some. There are clearly non-government organizations, and they're here in Washington by the hundreds, and they write all sorts of papers, and they try to influence legislation. You have deep-pocketed, wealthy people, like the George Soroses of the world, or the Gates, or others. And of course, they, to a certain degree, invest in their policy visions for America, and they do that through politicians. You have academics, and we're always hearing from academics here in Washington on testimony and the like. But these people, plus the outside world, coming to Washington being probably the most powerful city in the world, they try to plug in to Washington power brokers, and they try to influence them. And I've been in meetings, hundreds of meetings, seeing this happen. So, I kind of know how this process works. I've been told all sorts of stories in the past why they couldn't do something that, most Americans would say, well, why can't we do that? Why can't, for instance, we build a wall? Why can't we keep immigrants out that have serious threats against our safety? There are a lot of compelling reasons that are conjured up behind the scenes and feed an agenda that is not ours. And then I would argue, as I have directly and indirectly in the deeper state, that there's something else going on here. And that is, as those that are spiritually alive understand that there's a spiritual war, whether it's in Ephesians talking about powers and principalities, but they're kind of pulling the strings behind some of these influencers as well. And all you have to do is meet a few of them, and I have, and you find out very quickly that they're very nefarious. They have some evil intentions, and unfortunately, we've seen them play out over the years. So it is an interesting environment. It's a dangerous environment, but it's our environment, and we need to deal with it.
You talk a lot about globalism in the book, and we were introduced to globalism in this campaign as almost the first time that the world became educated, or the American public became educated about globalism. Walk us through an understanding of the underpinnings and why globalism is such a threat to the American way and is an advancement of an agenda which we might call the One World Order or the New World Order.
Well, certainly the literature is very clear. When you look at what globalism is, most people think instant communications around the world, either social media or watching some sort of catastrophe happening before your very eyes. We're accustomed to that. We're accustomed to globalized cuisine. You can have Japanese food here in America, and you can have German food, but you can have American food when you travel to Beijing, of all places. And of course, you have a very transient labor pool that are all over the world. People come here for jobs, and we go there for jobs. So the idea is simplistically that we're becoming one big, world where there aren't any real borders, and we're kind of mixed together. And people such as Hillary Clinton and George Soros, the Henry Kissingers of the world, believe that this is good, that this is the way we ought to go, that we ought to remove borders. And of course, when Mr. Trump came in, he pointed his finger and said the progressives, which I just named a few, they're the people that reach back 100 years and they follow the influence of Friedrich Hegel, who was probably one of the fathers of progressivism, who had contaminated not only Woodrow Wilson, probably the worst president in the history of the United States. There are some others that are contesting that, I'd argue. And then, of course, Roosevelt, who gave us the New Deal, Social Security, and a whole host of other social programs. And even Barack Obama, who subscribes to that progressive worldview. These progressives, they like globalism. They like to embrace the United Nations, international institutions, but they also embrace sort of a humanistic-like religion because they believe that they know best for you and me. They believe that they ought to run the government, and they are feudalistic. In other words, they should tell us what we should eat, what we should drive, what we should do for work. They want to give us little choice. And so you have them really motivated to a large degree, I'd say, by a paganistic, humanistic type of religion. Now, I'd argue that some of them are far worse than that. They, in fact, may have some demonic influences, which kind of turn things upside down. But I'm not sure they necessarily understand. Much like you look in the history of, certainly the Christian history in the Bible, and see very clearly that there are examples of demonic influence in those days. Why would we believe that it's not evident in the world we see today? And in fact, I have some firsthand observations here in Washington that compels me to believe that it's very much alive and well today.
I think what people fail to realize is that from an elected official standpoint, we have, 537 elected officials at the top of the government pyramid. That's the president, vice president, senators, the Senate, and the House. That is the entirety of what the public vote puts into power. It's estimated that I believe the federal government's around 9 million employees, and of that 537 are elected. So how deep, how far down can our elected officials really influence the appointees who have survived going back to Clinton appointments, going back to Jimmy Carter appointments, who are still there in these roles, carrying on the agenda of loyalty to the picture that's on their wall, which is not the picture of Donald J. Trump, but the picture of the president that was in office when they were appointed.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile this?
Well, when you look at, or Rabbi, when you look at what a president appoints, they're probably in the neighborhood of 4,500, 5,000 positions that she fills. Only about 1,200 of those, maybe a little more, are Senate confirmed. And so, the president can put his or her loyalists in those positions. Now, when you look at the expanse of federal government, it's not just here in Washington, it's all over the country and some abroad, then they have to promulgate policies, and then they have to follow through in checking those policies to see that they're implemented properly. Well, as you can guess, when you have a bureaucracy as big as the United States government, it's civilian as well as the millions of people that serve in the armed forces, that it's hard often to get not only your message out, but get your intent out. And so you have to constantly follow up. And you're kind of at the mercy of agendas out there. Because I work embedded in a major bureaucracy, the largest in the United States government, the Pentagon, that I see day after day people that have their own agendas, and those agendas are not necessarily that of President Trump. There's not, in my position, because I can manage my own Paul Mill advisors. We're contractors, and so I'm not a civil servant per se, so I can't redirect, but I can observe. And I'm observing time and again where these people are pushing an agenda that does not serve this president's elected agenda, and therefore it makes it very difficult unless his representatives personally involve themselves in the depths of the decision making that is so critical to making this federal government function. So we all knew that as soon as Barack Obama left office, that there were all sorts of rumors, some of which have been confirmed, that his minions embedded themselves deep within the bureaucracy and continue to carry out his agenda. I found that to be true in some circumstances, and therefore, unless the Trump people chase them down and either extract them from the bureaucracy or change their influence, in other words, demote them, they'll continue to do what they've been doing. That's the nature and the momentum of bureaucracies, and it has been for ages. It's just the nature of what we're dealing with. And so you throw in that evil intent, you throw in that outside advisors, and you end up with an incredibly difficult effort. After all, the president promised to drain the swamp. So did Ronald Reagan. Every president promises to drain the swamp. Well, the swamp critters are very well embedded. They're very vicious, and they're hard to get rid of. And unfortunately, even this president, who is well intended, is having a difficult time.
I don't know what year the Marxist agenda began to enter into the federal government. I guess it goes back to J. Edgar Hoover. It goes back, to a time when America was going to dig into the personal lives, the McCarthyism, the concern for communism and Marxism. However, it's become the playbook for every liberal, for every progressive, to go exactly by that playbook. Now you have world leaders who are billionaires who are reading from that playbook, and they're influencing our government. So you have this globalism meets Marxism, and Bernie Sanders being the absolute, all of a sudden it became okay to call somebody in America a socialist. In my lifetime, in your lifetime, this wasn't something that was complimentary. It wasn't something that we were accepting of. We were a republic based on a democratic set of principles, and socialism was not going to be any part of the American way. And here this man comes along, and we call him a socialist, and there's no uproar. As a matter of fact, there's a whole movement that gets behind him, and that movement still exists. Is this a part of the exposed? You know, we look at the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot beneath, but is this new acceptable socialism, this new acceptable Marxism, is this a part of that deeper state?
Oh yeah. Friedrich Hegel and Karl Marx were contemporaries, and they kind of, stole one another's ideas back and forth. And of course, they were the ones that ultimately influenced the likes of Princeton professor, then New Jersey governor, and eventually President Woodrow Wilson, who of course was all excited about the League of Nations, excited about the income tax, excited about all these big social ideas, because he, after all, was the brightest man in the world and knew exactly how to run things. And we've seen that creeping through the federal government. Ever since certainly that initial burst of socialism or radicalism entering into the federal government. We find it very much today. As far as looking over our shoulders and stealing our identity and manipulating us by peering into our private matters, I think technology has helped the progressive movement very much. Today you see the manipulation of the social media for the purposes of certain progressive politicians. You certainly see the mainline media, which is bought and sold by the likes of people like George Soros, who invest heavily in schools of journalism that own a lot of these major outlets, and of course are not afraid of intimidating people that run those institutions for their own purposes. These are part and parcel of the world we've grown up in. And of course, on the side, a long time ago, we saw the likes of Dewey, who of course established an education system that has been the opiate of the masses, the way in which the progressives have been very effective at manipulating our children. Certainly in that time, it was our parents and our grandparents, and it continues all the way up to the day in the likes of the public education system that is always politically correct, and of course does not promote individual accountability and the types of things that I think biblical believers believe is the appropriate things to do. So we're dealing with these realities. We've inherited them. They've been allowed to continue through the years, and I don't see a near end of it unless there's a major turnaround, and I don't think even Mr. Trump can do that.
Well, it's a fascinating study. We're talking with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, author of The Deeper State, Inside the War on Trump by Corrupt Elites, Secret Societies, and the Builders of an Imminent Final Empire. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into who are these corporate elites, who are these secret societies, how they're operating, and what we as believers can do about it. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're talking to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, author of The Deeper State, Inside the War on Trump by Corporate Elites, Secret Societies, and the Builders of an Imminent Final Empire. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, welcome back to this program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Bob, and you've given me permission, and I thank you for allowing me to call you Bob. As I read the book, it became apparent that the Washington that America has been led to believe exists, going back to the days of the Revolution, going back to the days of the Constitution, never really existed, and that there were influencers and societies, organizations, and affiliations that were the underpinning. We want to say it was based on biblical Judeo-Christian values, but we do see that most of the authors of the Constitution were Freemasons. We do see that their affiliation to secret societies and to organizations who had a purpose which was contrary to the stated purpose of government. And the government of the Constitution was minimal, it was local, it was state-based, and the concept of this enormous federal controlling entity was foreign to the authors of the Constitution. In the deeper state, you introduce us to some of these secret societies. Who are some of them? We know the names George Soros, but what's he running? What kind of, I think George Soros and I think Bernie Madoff. All of a sudden in my mind, it's this shell game of wanting me to constantly look over here, the Siegfried and Roy kind of agenda that says, look over here because I'm doing something over here and I don't want you to see it. And it seems to be an ongoing thing, but you've been able to identify some of these organizations and their agendas, and who are they and what is it they really want?
Yeah, well, there are a number of them, obviously. Some say hundreds, but the big ones are like the Bilderberger Group, started in the early 50s in the Netherlands, and it's named after a hotel there in the Netherlands. Now, what happens is it's, quote, an informal group of the high rollers of the world, the deep-pocketed people, the political leaders that have a concern that they want a world in their own making. And so they're called the kingmakers. Although they have secret meetings annually, and where they bring all of these select people from across the world together, they say that they aren't making policy, but of course the evidence suggests otherwise. And in fact, it's interesting, in 1991 in Baden-Baden, the Bilderbergers hosted a young governor from the obscure state of Arkansas, and they promised him lots of money and lots of publicity if he would run for president and then carry their water. And specifically, Bill Clinton, embraced NAFTA and a number of other agenda items that belong to the Bilderbergers and their international globalized group. He got elected out of nowhere, it seemed like. We've seen something similar with Barack Obama. We've seen something similar with Jimmy Carter. All luminaries in what I would argue the not so good president category. So the Bilderbergers, interestingly, back in 2016, I think it was March, they met off the coast of Georgia, and a friend of mine, now deceased, reported on what was going on. And interestingly, they gathered some of the luminaries from the Washington establishment, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, others that names you'd recognize. And really the focus, according to people that were inside, was how to defeat Trump, how to keep Trump from becoming president. Well, they obviously failed. They didn't understand his populist appeal, but that's what they had every intention of doing. And of course, there are other very substantive things that have come from those associations. So you have the Bilderbergers, you have the Council for Foreign Relations. That really traces its backs and roots to Woodrow Wilson, who I already said is, I argue, the worst president in the history of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, of course, formed a group of people that went with him at the end of World War I to Paris and tried to negotiate the creation of what eventually became, short-lived though, the League of Nations, which was supposed to answer the world's, stop future wars, address humanitarian issues, and basically, like a good progressive he was, right, to bring about global order, global government. Well, he failed, but the Council for Foreign Relations came back to this nation under the guise of a bunch of smart people that Wilson had in Paris. They joined up with some Brits, and then, of course, in New York City, and a bunch of businessmen. They formed the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, the Council of Foreign Relations is important because they are rank progressives, and they have, since the time of Franklin Roosevelt, filled a very high percentage of the most important jobs in federal government, to include, to a certain degree, even the Trump administration. H.R. McMaster is a CFR. They're the trade representative, CFR. The labor representative, labor secretary, CFR. And of course, the wife of McConnell, who is the majority leader. So there is sort of an incestuousness between these secret organizations. They don't call themselves that, of course, but these organizations that have a very clear agenda that is published, for instance, the CFR in their Foreign Affairs magazine. It's clear what they want. They've been publishing it for years and years. Then, of course, you have the likes of David Rockefeller, who, of course, died a little less than a year ago at the ripe age of 103. And, of course, David and his father and grandfather have been incredibly influential in the progressive point of view for many, many years. In fact, it was the Rockefellers, David's father, who gave the land for the United Nations there on Manhattan many years ago. And of course, the foundation today pushes a very radical pro-abortion, pro-homosexual agenda. And their webpage is just replete with all of these sorts of things. And of course, they're members of the Bilderbergers, they're members of the Trilateral Commission, they're members of CFR. It is rather incestuous because they kind of travel from one elite secret group to another. There are others I talk about in the book, certainly the Bohemian Grove situation, and I make some interesting, found some WikiLeaks emails that really exposed a lot of what was going on. And they were conducting what I would argue is federal government business in a secret way, which of course doesn't serve our best interest, but serves theirs. So there are a lot of these organizations, a lot of people that are, luminaries that we hear about that, have a vision for the future of America and the future of the world. But by and large, most Americans are unaware.
I look at the senatorial race that just took place here in Alabama. I know that meetings are set up all the time with those who have an agenda that they want to advance, who are saying, I'm going to make contributions to your campaign. I'm going to get you early on in this process. You align yourself with us, and we're going to help navigate your career. But when you get to Washington, you're going to be your own man. Now, you and I both know that people who are sponsors, we're beholden to those sponsors. That's why this is a sponsored-free, commercial-free program, because I'm going to talk about everybody and everything, and my phone's not going to ring, and somebody's going to say, we're going to take X amount of dollars away from funding. We're just not going to do it. We do everything through contributions, through speaking engagements, so that we are free to have this conversation. But you have these idealistic young up-and-comers that have been councilmen and then state representatives, then they want to become part of the federal government. How many of those do you find are being influenced and controlled by this deeper state? And are they getting to them early on and drafting them into the ideology?
Well, I think that for the most part, that's true. Keep in mind, politics is governed to a large degree by the purse. It's difficult to run for political office every 2 years. And unless you're independently wealthy, and of course, Mr. Trump was the exception, right. Then you have to rely upon somebody to help fund your campaign. And in some places, it's rather contentious and incredibly expensive. So eventually, most people become beholden to those that can bring money to the table, that buys ads and staff and the like. So we've seen that, through the ages. It's become especially pronounced here in the last few decades, where, here recently, what was it, in 2016, Hillary Clinton spent, what, $1 billion on a presidential
Right.
campaign that, even the New York Times said there was no chance she would lose. Well, obviously, they didn't understand the will of the American people, which ran contrary to, her the best political advisors. But here in Washington, it's difficult, if not impossible, not to be tainted to a certain degree by those who wield political influence behind the scenes, whether through their money or their information or connections. If, for instance, I write about in The Deeper State of, the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Well,
Right.
it's so classic because I've seen it firsthand, that you have outside influencers that are saying, I need you to vote this way, or I need you to go over here and do this and that. I can recall going into a congressperson's office when I was at the Family Research Council, and occasionally I go to the Hill. And I was working with a very prominent exile from China. And he was the son of a Chinese general officer, but had been in prison himself. And we were, going in there warning this particular, member of Congress about voting on certain pieces of legislation that need to hammer at China and try to persuade them to turn the direction of their policy. Well, this congressperson said, look, you don't understand. I'm beholden, and these are my words, I'm beholden to these industries that frankly need China's support and welcome so that they can continue their business. So, this person said, no, I'm not going to vote against them. I'm going to vote for them. Even though this congressperson said, yeah, I agree that this is nefarious and evil and wrong, but I just can't help it.
You are a Bible-believing, biblical worldview military professional that has had influence into the lives of many subordinates, many superiors, many in government, in the Pentagon, many in the House, many in the government. In your book, you have the call of Nehemiah as one of the chapters, because one of the things that I admire about you is that there's a lot of people out there that say, here's the problem, and that's where they stop. It's kind of stating the obvious. I think we all know the problem, but we don't know what to do about it. Biblically, America is going to fall. We know America is going to fall. Do we have to be the first nation to fall? That's not my personal desire. Can we be the last nation to fall? That is my personal desire, that let the rest of the world go to pot, let them go down this path and this dividing line of Islam and the rest of the world is clearly the demarcation that God is making eminently clear, that Satan, from the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, is enlisted Islam to be his army and the army of the Antichrist, added to that any numbers of believers and other non-believers to build this army. In this chapter, you address Nehemiah, the watchman on the wall. What is your word of encouragement? You clearly stated we have a deep state problem. The question is, can we do something about it? And if there is something we can do about it, excuse me, what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, I use Nehemiah because here Nehemiah, as everybody knows, that's read the book, was captured in Iran, then Persia, serving the king, had a great opportunity through Esther, and took advantage of that to go back and try to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Of course, back in those days, a wall was your only defense against marauding armies on the outside. And so, his heart was just torn that his homeland and the temple of God lay in terrible ruins. And so he had every intention of going back, which he did. And he ignored all the critics. And you're always going to have critics, even today. Politicians are constantly dealing with critics and trying to curry favor with those that can help them. Nehemiah ignored that. He said, look, my focus is on God and in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem to bring safety back to those people. Well, today, we need to, I think as Bible believers, we need to look into the text of God's word and see clearly that nothing's new under the sun, as Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes. There's plenty of evidence out there in his word as to what we ought to do in the contemporary world. We ought to live for Christ. We ought to live as God has given us opportunity to proclaim the truth. And unfortunately, we have a lot of lies that are in the media, a lot of lies coming out of the mouths of so-called well-intended political leaders, but we have to hold them accountable and while we can. And so that begins at the local level, whether it's a school board or a city council, hold them accountable. Certainly a member of Congress and even the President of the United States. Truth, just because you're in a position, does matter. It matters wherever you happen to be. And those values that we hold dear in God's word need to be in the marketplace of ideas, because they will win out in the long run. But unfortunately, too often we, even believers, cave when we ought to stand up and be very bold. Be bold like Elijah. Be bold in the face of great opposition. So, I try to encourage all believers that, if these are the end times, don't be too far from where God would have you be, and don't be afraid of declaring that the emperor doesn't have any clothes on. For in fact, there's a lot of evil out there, and we need to call out that evil when we get the opportunity.
How influential do you see China? There was a period of time, I think over the last 25 years, that I saw a report that China's real estate holdings in the United States were staggering. That the land titles, how much property that was owned by China in the United States was just staggering. We look at the North Korea situation. We see an agenda at work that is kind of it's almost a sidebar to this other deeper state agenda, but I know that there is a connection to it. I know that it is part of joining together with a communist, Marxist, socialist regime. Are we trying to curry favor in the wrong way? Are we going about this North Korea approach and this lack of pressure, real pressure on China? Are we operating from a standpoint of strength or fear? And the second part of that is are we going to have to do what Ronald Reagan did, which was focus on rebuilding the military, restoring our physical strength so that we can be respected, because we have a deteriorated military, our war machine is rusty, and can we really take on anybody if there were to be a battle?
China is a respecter of strength, and it's clear that the United States has waffled with regard economically and militarily over the last, certainly during the Obama years and arguably before that, that we've been weakened and we've kind of backed somewhat out of our previous obligations. We were a stabilizing force around the world. And in that wake, in that vacuum, as the foreign minister of Germany said just a couple of weeks ago, that China and Russia have been filling in that vacuum. China does have a lot of our debt, not all of it, but a lot of it. China has, for the last few decades, and I've been chronicling this for that period of time. Sorry about the phone here. I've been chronicling for a long time. Like, not much. For a long time, just that, and that is a major buildup of their armed forces. They have, for instance, have one aircraft carrier. They're building a second. They will have 4 by the 2030. They have a Navy that rivals ours in terms of numbers, and sophistication is growing. They have an Air Force and a ballistic missile systems that are, certainly aimed at deterring the United States in a way that reminds me very much of the Cold War. China is going to be the world's largest economy in another decade. It's the second largest economy now, and certainly our largest trading partner, to the tune of about $650 billion a year, but half of that is in debt that they hold on us as it grows every year. So China is a serious, serious problem in the future. Now that impacts the North Korean situation because, as we all know, 90% of North Korea's trade is with the communist China regime. And so if you really want to stop North Koreans from firing ballistic missiles and testing nuclear devices, the answer goes through Beijing, not to Pyongyang. But at the same time, I have to say as an aside, the Russians are very much helping Kim Jong-un. They wouldn't have an intercontinental ballistic missile today if it were not for the Russians, because I think, as we've seen over the last year, the ICBM launches have been successful, not before that. And why? Because, believe it or not, they found some new rocket engines somewhere in eastern Ukraine that found their way into rockets that were launched out of North Korea. So you have a situation which, in spite of agreements by the United Nations to sanction North Korea, that Beijing secretly, as well as Russia, continue to support that regime. Why? Because they need a buffer. They want a buffer against the South Koreans, against the U.S., against the Japanese. This will continue, and I do believe that we're on the precipice of what will be a dual Cold War, and not only with the Chinese, which will be far worse than what we experienced up to 1991 with the Russians, but also one with the Russians, and the evidence is mounting there.
Bob, it has been an absolute pleasure as always. You're deep with information. I want to encourage everyone to get a copy of The Deeper State by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, Inside the War on Trump by Corrupt Elites, Secret Societies, and the Builders of an Imminent Final Empire. If you've been wondering what the media is talking about and who they're talking about, this is a breakdown of who they are, their origins, and what you as a believer can do about it. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.